Hi, I'm your friendly internet conman, and I didn't know I was a conman until I read this book. But I took it seriously because if I'm off base about plant-based diets, I want to know. And honestly, I have some concerns about vegan diets too. Some kids that are high school say maybe 20% of the girls have gone vegan, and a few of them have stopped going to Taco Bell for lunch, going instead to Krispy Kreme to eat donuts washed down with Pepsi. Ugh. I actually hoped I could skate past the conman label because this book is about being an omnivore. I've had so many awesome omnivores as guests like Marion Nestle. Even though I am vegan, I have tremendous respect for the Mediterranean and Asian diets that were consumed by the healthiest people in the world before the invasion of processed food and such high consumption of meat. On the other hand, I often recommend the books of physician Gemma Newman and pediatrician Reshma Shah, who are raising their own children vegan and promoting it to their patients. By this book's definition, anyone who promotes a plants-only diet is in on the con. So I guess these two are con women. Wow, that's a broad definition of a con. Promoting something you believe is true. Nevertheless, Jayne and I have a lot in common.
Another point on which I must be clear. Industrial, factory farming is abhorrent, and the wholesale clearing of the Amazon's forests for the raising and feeding of livestock must be halted.
This could be a popular book because it follows the successful formula of The Big Fat Surprise, written by a journalist so it's not boring, by an attractive, articulate mom, assuring you meat is nutritious and sustainable, and can save you from a scary vegan diet gone horribly wrong. It's a huge book in 4 parts: health, the planet, who's behind the con, and what we should eat. My episodes have been too long, so I'll break this into several episodes, starting with health. I'll end this episode with my initial feelings about whether this is a good faith effort or we're dealing with some bad actors. Part 1 starts out with a bang. Why do we think meat is bad for us? It jumps straight into Ansel Keys publishing a chart in 1953 and 2 statisticians publishing one with more data in 1957. I thought, whoa, I have a solid science background and it took me a year to really know those studies, and I had to interview several of the scientists involved to get my questions answered. How can consumers be expected to understand after reading just a few pages in this book? I did a fairly deep dive about these studies if you're interested. Teaser, that 1957 paper also has a chart of mortality versus animal protein consumption, and it shows an even stronger correlation than saturated fat with mortality. That data is from the United Nations for 22 different countries. Jayne and the movie Fat Fiction cite this study in support of eating meat, but they don't show this chart from the study. We've known this for 65 years. What you'll discover if you watch it is that precious few people who talk about those studies have ever fully read them. I spoke to a few people who have, like Marion Nestle, and our jaws just drop when we see what people say about them. I can imagine most people who read this chapter would think, wow, this book is well researched. She's read so many studies. The thing is, I'm very familiar with most of these studies, and I know how long it takes to really understand them. For example, Henry Blackburn is sharp as a tack at 97 and ran Ansel Keys' 7-country study for 50 years, and was there at the University of Minnesota for the Minnesota Coronary experiment Jayne mentions, which was also done in Ansel Keys' group. I spent hours corresponding with Henry about them over a course of months. For those interested in the Minnesota Coronary experiment, I did a deep dive on it. It's a fascinating study of a well-designed experiment where the scientists couldn't anticipate external factors coming to crash the party. In this case, it was the unexpected deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, something I know well because my mom was one of those mentally ill who was deinstitutionalized at that time. Jayne's takeaway from those 2 studies is completely different than mine. But I think there is a simple question we can ask without years of study and debates about fat. How long do meat eaters live, and what are their long-term health outcomes? Isn't that what matters? If you ask that question about fish, everyone could say, oh, for sure. Coastal communities surrounding the Mediterranean, Japan, and the Blue Zones who ate a moderate amount of fish lived long and well for millennia. Everyone knows that. But if you ask someone like Nina Teicholz about meat, who had a decade to prepare an answer to that question, backed by a Texas billionaire to the tune of $500,000 a year to do PR and lobbying to promote beef, this is the best answer she could give.
Any evidence that you could cite that meat diets are healthier than plant-based diets?
There's 2 systematic reviews of clinical trials on meat that I know of that show that cardiovascular outcomes are improved. One of them looked at 0.5 ounces or servings of meat per day and showed increased benefits, cardiovascular benefits for eating the meat versus not eating the meat. And there is one other review on cardiovascular outcomes that also showed that meat was beneficial, looked better for cardiovascular outcomes.
In contrast, there are thousands of definitive studies showing the risk of eating red meat. I've been fascinated by this question since I was a young teen in the 60s, and Jack LaLanne told me if it comes from a cow or a pig, don't eat it. But my dad believed meat was super healthy before his fatal heart attack, so what's a young teen to think? I sometimes wonder if I'm the only crazy who studied this question throughout history. Here's a fascinating book published by Elma Stewart in 1889. What Must I Do to Get Well and How Can I Keep So? By one who has done it. She used the Dr. James Salisbury meat and hot water therapy to overcome her ailments, and it worked for several years. Salisbury was a respected scientist with a steak named after him who wrote this book in 1888, The Relation Between Food and Disease. I've read dozens of these books from this century and ones long ago, and the outcome has always been the same as it is today. People often report near-term gains in their health like Elma did when she increased her meat consumption, but she and Salisbury couldn't provide evidence for long-term health of the diet. That's why I think so many meat-heavy diets became very popular in their day, like Dr. Salisbury's or the Cutters in 1908, both of them Harvard-educated physicians. There was Pennington, Atkins, Scarsdale, Paleo, Primo, Keto, Carnivore, and a bunch of others. Keto and Carnivore are very old diets. None of those diet founders were able to show the diets led to longevity.
Now, this diet's been out there for 30 years, or close to 30 years.
And I haven't been able to fund a study. I've asked
excuse me, 10 million books in print and you can't fund the study?
Now I can.
In contrast, the diets that did produce long-lasting health stuck. Ancel Keys' Mediterranean diet that he promoted 70 years ago, the Japanese diet of many millennia ago, the Adventist vegetarian diet of 1863 that has made them the longest-lived population in the world. The Adventists don't require their members to go vegetarian, but the striking thing is the ones who eat even a little meat have dramatically lower health outcomes. Same religion, same social structure, no smoking or drinking, but dramatically different outcomes when adding a moderate amount of animal foods. This study is one of the most respected in all of nutrition by other scientists for how well it's designed. And it's partly because Gary Fraser, the scientist who runs it, is so respected. Jayne does cite some good studies, like the Cochrane Library study of saturated fat in 2020. But it's over 260 pages and it takes a very qualified scientist to eke out an uncertain result because the studies were short-term relative to the time it takes to develop heart disease. It's also about saturated fat, which isn't perfectly linked to meat consumption. Saturated fat is complicated because there is a threshold of effect where risk doesn't change much until you get above a certain level of consumption, and then it stops changing above a higher level. Even so, Cochrane reported the included long-term trials suggested that reducing dietary saturated fat reduced the risk of combined cardiovascular events by 21%. Relative to Ancel Keys' 50-year study, those trials were not very long-term. Rather than depend on crude United Nations food consumption data like the 1957 paper I showed earlier, Keys and teams of scientists went to 16 areas around the world and rigorously assayed the food men were eating there to get the saturated fat content of their meals. More than a dozen scientists have followed the men for over 50 years, including Henry. These are abbreviations of the areas, with Finland having almost 10x the heart attack rate of Japan, data that wasn't contested. Can you guess who was eating meat and cheese, pushing their saturated fat consumption to over 20% of calories? And who was eating fish and veggies? That wasn't contested either. If you like whodunit mysteries, you might like Marion Nestle's books about food politics. She's the best in the world at uncovering the shenanigans of the food companies and how successful their strategies are. But these books may shake your faith in humanity. In my 50 years in science and tech, I've been lucky to work in fields where scientists are considered geniuses, and in fields like global warming and nutrition where the public thinks we're idiots. The difference isn't the quality of scientists. It's whether big companies mobilize to discredit them. One of the most notorious industry front groups, funded by a constellation of companies like Monsanto, is ILSI. They have a very long history of discrediting the science indicating smoking and sugar are unhealthy. One of ILSI's constellation of bad actors is Bradley Johnston. He co-authored a paper in the Annals of Medicine that ILSI funded, which was a scathing attack on advice to eat less sugar. The paper claimed previous advice about sugar was based on weak evidence and can't be trusted. That's their playbook. What makes the journal Annals good for this is if you declare no conflicts of interest, their policy is to publish your paper and not check. Perfect for Bradley Johnston, who can let investigative journalists expose him long after the paper generates headlines. Which is exactly what he did as lead author in his 2019 paper in Annals, running the same playbook for red meat as they had for smoking and sugar. For nutrition scientists who understand study design and how front groups work, it doesn't pass the laugh test. But it's a great victory for food companies because their product is doubt, and after seeing the headlines, most consumers had no idea what to think. Except nutrition science is garbage, which, in this paper's case, it was. What's fascinating is how this book covered the two papers Bradley Johnston was involved with. Sugar and red meat, written just a few years apart. In the case of sugar, the book has a whole chapter on it as the biggest of the bad guys, but did not reference his sugar paper. In the case of his red meat paper, the book cites it as exonerating red meat, and that passage has become one of the most highlighted passages in the book, according to my Kindle. The two papers used the same method, which is to say, we do declare. The organizations that produce guidelines around the world are not rigorous, don't you know? They usually include long-term observational studies, the kind that help them figure out that smoking and trans fats are no bueno. And we love to still be selling those products, very profitable. Those studies paint a grim picture about red meat, so let's categorize them as weak and tell consumers they can ignore them. The genius of this playbook is you can sound scientific while denying science. Yes, we know we have mountains of data carefully collected over a century from millions of people around the globe, and we know how damning it looks. But you can ignore it because I declare it doesn't pass scientific rigor. And I got the Annals of Medicine to publish it. And the thousands of scientists who collected it all, they're so weak, don't you know? Beef industry 1, science 0. Anyone feel played? True confession. When a journalist or young doctor without a background in company playbooks come into nutrition, I think, uh-oh, they're gonna get played. The beef industry is just too good. So how do you explain a journalist like Michael Pollan who didn't get played? The answer is he collaborated with Marion Nestle, who's made a career of understanding how this works. I lived this movie as an earth scientist where I watched ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers play most Americans for decades. They discredited any earth scientist who wasn't involved in oil exploration. So I interviewed Marion Nestle, who's still amazing at 85, to see what the differences were in nutrition. And the answer is same movie, different actors, a few different action scenes, but in this movie the Joker defeats Batman. So why do high meat diets keep being reinvented, becoming so popular and then abandoned? Relegated to selling ultra-processed food bars at Walgreens? Well, I think Jim Gaffigan knows one answer.
I wish I liked fish. I wish I was the person in the restaurant so, I don't get to go out to dinner that often, but instead of getting a delicious steak, I'll get the fish, because I like disgusting food. Who's the first person to walk into a harbor and go, hey, whatever reeks in here, let's eat that?
Upton Sinclair also explained it with his famous line, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon him not understanding it." The nutritional version of this quote is, "It's difficult for anyone to understand health when they believe their happiness depends on steak." There is no limit to the mental gymnastics we'll go through to believe beef is healthy. But we evolved eating meat. I don't know any paleoanthropologist who thinks we evolved eating meat that resembles modern cows. But they all agree we've been eating fish and plants for more than 2 million years. And unlike modern cows, modern fish do resemble the fish that huge swaths of the population evolved eating. This is a book about vegan diets being unsafe, a fair point, because we all know if they're not done well, they can be unsafe. If Jayne had argued fish can make them safer, I think most nutrition scientists would have said, fair point. That sounds like the Mediterranean diet. But she's tackled something that no one's been able to prove in over a century, that meat is healthy in the long term. Jayne would have had to address the methylmercury issue in fish, but that doesn't seem to be as toxic to men and postmenopausal women as the heme iron that's in red meat. It's in much greater levels per calorie than it is in fish. I did an episode about iron and so far it hasn't been contested. So, there are 6 chapters in the health section of this book and we've only touched on the first about the health of meat. The gist of the other chapters is plants have scary nutritional deficiencies. Those chapters contain a fire hose of concerns. So that we're not here all day, I'll focus on the big 2, B12 and iron, because there are terrible misperceptions about them that do harm. Yes, if you're going to be vegan, you absolutely have to supplement with B12 or get it through fortified foods like Oatly or Nooch. Only 2% of Americans are vegans, but over 6% of youngish Americans are thought to be B12 deficient, and over 20% of adults past 60 are thought to be deficient. This is in a country that has extraordinarily high meat consumption. I did an episode about B12 too, and it hasn't been contested yet either. There's a lot of talk in the book about iron deficiency and how rich meat is in it, especially in liver, and it is. There's also a quote with all caps about how oat milk is no substitute for cow's milk in children. You might want to follow the money with that quote. It's a tweet from Dr. Ayub. On his blog, he wrote about an entry, "This post is a collaboration with beef. It's what's for dinner." Also, left dangling like that without context is a dangerous thing. Here's what children's hospitals say. Despite the public perception of nutritional benefits, overconsumption of cow's milk is the leading cause of anemia in toddlers over 1 year of age. A hematologist explained why in his book, and it's common knowledge among pediatricians and hematologists, but it's not well known to the public. If children are fed cow's milk before 1 year of age, they can develop iron deficiency secondary to irritation in the gastrointestinal tract and subsequent bleeding. Likewise, older children who drink excessive amounts of cow's milk can also develop iron deficiency due to similar gastrointestinal irritation and the low iron content of a cow milk diet. The proteins in cow's milk formula are dramatically altered to mimic human breast milk and make them much safer.
And you mentioned the milk thing, and for children, this is particularly important. I was asked to comment on the fact yesterday that Nestlé is developing a new plant milk, a vegan milk for toddlers, especially for toddlers. I can see you shaking your head, Brian. And what did I think of this? And so I looked at the press release for this milk. And first of all, the thing that strikes you is that the press release says that this milk is providing the added nutrients that all children need. So they're admitting There are no nutrients in their plant milk itself, but they're adding a bunch of B12, vitamin C, calcium, vitamin A, iodine, zinc, iron. So, okay. Really, we need to be very clear that what is being given to this child in this milk is like a multivitamin pill.
That is scary until you realize their cow's milk for toddlers is fortified with 13 vitamins and minerals, some not found in cow's milk like vitamin E, and some low in cow's milk like iron and folic acid. And they have to contend with the lactose intolerance problem. Nestlé's top 3 tips for toddler health are to up their iron intake, give them a rainbow of veggies, and include plenty of whole grains. There is a horrifying chapter in this book about malnourished vegan babies and the parents who get sent to jail.
A Florida mother who says she fed her child a vegan diet has been found guilty of first-degree murder after her child died from starvation.
Jayne and I agree those stories are tragic. Those are mainly stories of starvation, and the numbers paint a grim picture in America among parents of every dietary persuasion. What this book didn't mention is the rate of horrifying foodborne illnesses coming from animal agriculture that can no longer be treated with antibiotics.
Salmonella sickens and kills more of us than any other foodborne pathogen.
About 1 in 4 pieces of raw chicken carry salmonella.
The strains of salmonella that are showing up on these chickens are tougher, stronger, and many of them are antibiotic resistant.
Those infections strike families of every dietary persuasion because pathogens from animals get onto our plants from irrigation water tainted by animal agriculture. I was an earth scientist in water testing, and this is something that still gives me nightmares. So what is my takeaway from the first part of this book, the part about health? I think Jayne has a point that plant-only diets can be unhealthy, at least if they're not done right. If you do want to go for a plants-only diet like I've done for almost 2 decades, I recommend the books from the conwomen because they're respected doctors who've been in this for decades, and I could tell as I read their books that they both thoroughly understand the studies. With all due respect to Jayne, she's a journalist with no medical or scientific background who's only been at this for 3 years. And I don't like saying this about someone who seems to have good intentions, but she doesn't seem to have the thorough grasp of the studies she cites that the conwomen do. If you take her point that no one should risk a plant-only diet, then I recommend Elizabeth Blackburn's or Walter Willett's books. Dr. Blackburn is a first-class scientist, a Nobel Prize winner who thoroughly understands her references. Walter is the most cited scientist in medicine in the world by other scientists. He understands the studies better than anyone because he wrote the most respected textbook on them. Well, respected by other scientists, not necessarily respected by people who haven't been involved in study design. That's understandable. Jayne describes him as a well-known advocate of vegetarian diets, but no worries. His book has plenty of fish, chicken, and even beef recipes. Here's his recipe for double mushroom meatloaf with a pound of ground beef. Beef is an occasional indulgence for him, not a staple. So is this book in good faith? I want to believe that. She opens with a great story about meeting the awesomely colorful Trent Luce, a 6th-generation Nebraskan rancher with a popular TV show.
But before we get to Belinda and talk about the demonization of animal proteins and fats, which you know has been top of my bucket list for quite some time.
I like him. I interviewed Montana farmer Bob Quinn, and we really hit it off. And I worked some summers on a ranch. It's got to be tough to see scientists like me talking smack about beef, so he's on a very understandable mission to defend it. Jayne said of Trent and the head of Nemi, a dairy brand, "It is not an exaggeration to say that I could not have written this book without them." On the other hand, the book reads like an updated UK version of her friend Nina Teicholz's book. I think most nutrition scientists would say off the record, as so many have said to me, that Nina is a bad actor. Some have said it on the record. She's funded by an Enron billionaire we don't know much about and Nina rarely discloses. Her Nutrition Coalition's only activities seem to be PR and lobbying for the beef industry, and attacking scientists who believe the healthiest diets are light on beef, like the Mediterranean diet. In the next episode, I'll cover the environmental section of the book. That's something I feel like I know a lot about as a former Earth scientist. Like every Earth scientist, I'm as traumatized about the deforestation of the Amazon as cattle ranchers are about the destruction of their way of life. Here's hoping that section is in good faith and presents a solution.
Stop obsessing about protein. Your kids don't need more protein. I have 4 sons, and the one who's 27 didn't listen to me, and he came back a year later and said, "Dad, I've been looking on the web. Dude, you are right. Thanks, son. Great. I'm your dad. I'm a nutrition scientist at Stanford, and you listen to the web, not me."